What's up, everyone? Welcome to today's video. Welcome to the Video Game Fight School channel. Thank you very much for tuning in. In my last few videos where I've talked about B.L.A.D.E being an Xbox exclusive, I've also been reading your comments, and some of you have made mention of what you think is the hypothesis that PC players and the amount of people who actually play on PC are more than likely not able to support a game like Marvel's B.L.A.D.E. Now, the reality of that has to take into account a lot of data points. So let's go ahead and look into that, because that will help us to be able to frame a better perspective as to how the PC platform may be pivotal or not pivotal if B.L.A.D.E as a game makes its way as an exclusive to the Xbox platform. Seeing how this has been a question from a lot of people lately, it's quite interesting to see that a lot of folk are actually interested in this game, and I think it's very good because it's opened the floor for the conversation about exclusives as a whole. For the most part, I've always been someone who advocated that games should be everywhere. In fact, I've even advocated that PlayStation, if they wanted to maintain a competitive edge, did not need to bring their games to Xbox, but they needed to bring it to PC day one, because PC had what it took to be able to give them more sales and almost double their money if they actually wanted that to happen. But it seemed like a lot of people who are invested in a PlayStation ecosystem have always said, well, this will make PlayStation lose its competitive edge. I never agreed, but now that B.L.A.D.E is more than likely going to be an exclusive, a lot of people are starting to see that their bet in the Microsoft side is hanging a lot on PC, having tested it out with Starfield, which ended up selling what we estimate to be around 6 million copies and reaching 12 million players or more. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the numbers that I want to kind of walk you guys through today, because I think these numbers or these data sets are really going to help put some perspective on this entire conversation. So in my last video, one of my audience members, Toxin7883, shout out to you. I appreciate you for actually making some input on my last video, or last two videos. And they said the number of PC players that have specs to run AAA games is the weak point of your argument. PC gaming and being able to run, say, the Division 2 or something like that is very, very different. From what I understand, I think this audience member of mine is saying that even though there are many PC players out there, because I've heard a different version of this argument before, that those who may be running specs that can actually support a video game like, say, B.L.A.D.E or the Division 2 or, say, a AAA game are probably not enough to provide a good sales market in order for them to be able to approach a game. The very first thing we have to actually point out with that argument is, number one, if that was the case, then how was it possible that a game like Starfield was able to reach 12 million players? Even if we divided it, say, 50% on the console, 50% on PC, and we say obliterate where they played or how they played, let's say some bought it on Game Pass. We're not going to use those numbers, but we know we have 12 million that even touched the game. So 12 million, or at least 50% of that, had enough of the PC specs to be able to run it. So if we're actually going with that premise, we have to at least admit that somewhere around 5 to 6 million players had enough of the PC specs to run Starfield. And we all know that Starfield is a very, very big game, a largely demanding game, and will more than likely be a game that demands more in terms of power for a game like B.L.A.D.E. I mean, if we also want to kind of dive into it, we can go back and look at Arcane's last few games and look at the PC specs of those games, and then we'll take a look further into hardware ownership for Steam gamers. In order for us to take things in better context, we know that the developers that are working on a B.L.A.D.E game are the ones that worked on Deathloop. So we're going to go on the Steam page here. We're going to look at the PC specs for Deathloop, and we're going to see what is somewhat the common factor in regard to what is necessary to have played the game at the time that it came out. So they wanted you to have a Core i5-8400 or an AMD Ryzen 5 1600, basically a 2.8 gigahertz CPU. They also wanted you to have, for the minimum requirements, 6 gigs of VRAM. So basically a 1060 or an RX 580, which provided you 8 gigs of VRAM. Keep in mind that these GPUs are actually very cheap at this moment in time. So the amount of VRAM that you actually have is quite nice in regard to be able to play a lot of games like this. Also, because of Arcane's art style, their games don't necessarily demand that you are able to render graphics at really high fidelity overall. So you can see why these particular requirements are, in a sense, very sensible when you actually narrow things down. When you also look at the recommended specs, you're also looking at about 6 gigs of VRAM and 8 gigs of VRAM with slightly better GPUs, basically the 2060 and RX 5700. So this is Deathloop. If we also want to go back again to look at another Arcane game that they've done, we can take a look at, say, a game like Dishonored 2. I was going to do Dishonored 1, but that game is actually much older than Dishonored 2. But at 2016, many of you may or may not know, this is when the PC market was growing. This is around the time that I moved from PlayStation 4 to PC because Bitcoin mining and a lot of, currencies were being mined at the time. So PC components were pretty much being sold for very cheap. It was easy to build a gaming PC back then. This was when the PC market grew by leaps and bounds that pushed Sony and Microsoft to start to invest in these ecosystems about a year or two later. But the requirements here are actually quite interesting. They need 8 gigs of RAM for the minimum requirements. They need about 2 gigs of VRAM in regard to what it is that you need to run Dishonored 2, and 3 gigs of VRAM. You also need about 8 gigs of VRAM if you were going with the recommended specs. But again, this game is somewhat old, but I thought I'd bring it to light because the game actually does look very good. It follows their art style, which is an art style that does follow the stylized variation of doing things. And then for another game that came out of Arcane, even though this game is not from the same studio that's going to be working on the B.L.A.D.E game, this is Prey. Prey, being a little bit more newer, is also another FPS that requires you to have around 8 gigs of VRAM or 8 gigs of RAM or 16 gigs of RAM, but in terms of VRAM, it requires for you to have about 2 gigs of VRAM or 4 gigs of VRAM. If we went ahead and said, okay, let us upgrade these requirements to something that we think is much better, I don't think their game is going to require for you to be able to have too much in regard to what it takes to run higher VRAM capabilities or higher CPU capabilities. Because at the end of the day, the studio is going to work using similar engine technology, similar rendering, and similar programming practices that would allow for their game to be able to run on various machines. Which brings us to the Steam hardware ownership data that we have right now. So every year or every so often, Steam will take a survey. If you have Steam on your computer, they'll pop up this particular notification and ask you and say, hey, do you want us to take your specs of your PC and use for our data? Yes or no? Someone like me, I actually answer no all the time to it, because if you actually took the amount of data from my household, it will convolute the data a lot. But I'm not going to go too much into that. However, when you look at what's popular and when you look at what's actually available in regard to the players who can run games, you'll realize that many of them are using 6-core CPUs, many of them have 16 gigs of VRAM, and many of them have anywhere from 2.3 gigs to 2.6 gigs of CPU speeds. Now, this number may look like, well, it's a little lower than what we had for some of the other CPU requirements for those games, but you have to understand that newer CPU technology, even though they may be running at lower frequencies, are actually better than some of the older CPUs that may have higher frequencies. So these are actually much more efficient chips that you're seeing come on the market in today's day and age. And even at 21%, it could mean that other percentages have higher and better CPU performance metrics out there. And then guess what? The highest usage of VRAM is about 8 gigs, and the 3060 is one of the most popular video cards that are being used. When you even delve into the data much more to see all the different GPU brands, Intel, AMD, or NVIDIA, you'll realize that a lot of people from around July all the way through November have actually been investing a lot more in GPUs like the 3060, and even some laptop GPUs of the 3060 model seem to be going up in numbers. So you can see the trend pretty much continuing to scale, and even GPUs like the 1060, the GTX 1060, is also basically doing a good job, because you can use the GTX 1060, the 6 gig model, to be able to run a lot of games. The 2060, which is also in the RTX family of one of the first 20 series to come out, seems to be having a good run as well. So that claim that a lot of PC users that can run a lot of games are not necessarily ubiquitous is quite misleading, because again, this is a Bethesda studio that has had its games published with minimum CPU and VRAM requirements that a lot of games can handle in today's day and age. So Unless, of course, the Blade game becomes an open world game and a game that requires a lot of demand, then I can see how a lot of these metrics will be outdated. However, we are suspicious that the game is more than likely going to make its way to the market in the next 2 to 4 years. Until that time reaches, I'm sure by then we'll be able to have much more availability of cheaper hardware. This is the thing that I've seen and noticed about a lot of folk when they talk about the PC ecosystem. A lot of them don't really know how the PC ecosystem works. You see, in PC land, a lot of people are actually comfortable buying used gear or used components to be able to build their PC. It's usually some people that say, well, I can't go or get behind buying any components that have already been used in the past because I'm afraid that something might go wrong. And you're correct. But for the most part, a lot of this stuff in regard to gaming is pampered. Somebody puts a GPU in their computer, they game with it, it stays there. They're not, slamming or banging it around for the 4 or 5 years they're using it. So usually the item runs very well. And a lot of PC users, they will take care of their gear because they're protecting and guarding it because they want to use it to continue to play their games. So the care with which a lot of these components are actually, kept with really do make for the used PC market to actually be a very viable place for you to be able to build your computer. So this is another thing a lot of people are not considering. The GTX 1060 user is tomorrow's 3060 owner. Why? Because the person that moves from the 3060 to the 4060 is going to have to find something to do with their old 3060 and they're going to sell it on the used market. So this is where the PC growth in regard to hardware actually is hiding from a lot of people. So when you're seeing a lot of these numbers right now, you might be looking at those and saying, well, it doesn't seem like these people have 3080s and whatnot or whatever it is. But the truth of the matter is, even though Arcane decides, oh, we're going to go ahead and start making our games to have 4K and all of this other stuff, you have to also think about the potential of them making sure that they're able to get as many players to play their games. So they will optimize settings that actually meet lower hardware specs in order for them to be able to improve sales. Any studio or any developer that does not do that might find themselves in a strange place. If you want to take an example, at this time, Arcane is actually one of the studios that I think is going to be in a good place. But Remedy is, in my opinion, struggling with their sales numbers right now for Alan Wake 2. Well, I think one of the reasons is probably because 2023 was already a stacked year. They didn't have a Steam release, but at the end of the day, on top of everything, they decided that they were going to go ahead and use new technologies like mesh shaders and all of that is not supported by GTX GPUs to give better performance. So if you had a 1080 Ti, which can pretty much run any game, your Alan Wake copy was basically bricked or bottlenecked and you could not really do much because the game was leveraging new technologies. I think that was a marketing strategy in error. Or maybe they were comfortable because they had Epic Games money and they decided to push the envelope. But their game is not going to be celebrated until that technology is ubiquitous for people to be able to run mesh shaders and appreciate the beautiful detail that the game had to offer. But I don't think Arcane is going that route. I think Arcane is going to go the route of being able to get the game to as many people as possible because that would be something that would have been heavily marketed and something that would have been heavily looked at when they were trying to get their hands on a game like Blade and make it an exclusive game. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think I've made a case from a data-driven perspective, or at least from a contextual perspective, especially with the Arcane games that have been out in the last few years, and even the data on Steam, that there is a PC base that will play the Blade game and have comfortable sales overall. I don't think a lot of this fear-mongering that people are doing is beneficial for the conversation regarding how this game is actually going to go. Because when you kind of think about it, at the end of the day, there has to be something that really does come into perspective when you think about Xbox taking the exclusivity to the next level, which is bringing it to all of its consumers, because Sony's PlayStation has actually set the tone of this market. And I think that's exactly what it is that Microsoft Xbox is responding to. But the PC base is a solid base. You cannot sleep on this base. Remember, Starfield was able to leverage at least 12 million players paying attention to the game. And if anybody says, well, most of those players were on Xbox, you still find yourself in a position where the Blade game will comfortably sit with those players on Xbox and sit with a marginal number of players on PC. The numbers or the scale or the sliders, however you want to move it, don't necessarily work. Anyways, this is pretty much my video. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks so much for watching. Peace out.